All right, good. It's showtime. Please, guys, let me know. Are we streaming? Yes, I see you are live now.
Is there something else I can help with?
All right, good. Great to have another Product Tank Sofia event. Uh, it's been a while since our last event. It was some months ago, but now we have a great topic and a great speaker tonight. But before that, let me introduce you very quickly to our community. Product Tank Sofia is the largest product management community in Bulgaria. And it is part of the Product Tank informal meetup. That is basically the largest product management organization in the world. Um, and we are affiliated to Mind the Product. You see the stats here. It's basically one thing that may describe the organization is that it's the go-to place for networking and learning and resource sharing in terms of product management. So, by the way, our members are different types of specialists, including UX designers and marketing managers, tech leads, developers, and so on, who are the organizers in Sofia, Maria, Diane, and Boris. That's me. So Maria and Diane are the founders of Product Tank Sofia. What about the events we're running? That's our main purpose, to run great events and provide the community with some networking capabilities, I could say, to put it like this. Um, so basically, product tank events run by us as product managers, and they are aimed at delivering best topics from the best speakers to other product managers, as well as the other types of specialists I mentioned. We had pretty, I could say, well attended events with speakers from many companies, including uh, the, the names you see on this slide. I'm not gonna mentioning them as explicitly. And the community, we have a Facebook group that is the largest Facebook group um, about product management in Bulgaria. We have many posts about jobs, resources, and very useful discussions. That is basically the best thing you can benefit from. But tonight we have a great and very experienced speaker, as I said. Um, how this event will be structured? We'll have the keynote speaker. It's Jon, who will share some great uh, insights and basically information about how to build great products using psychology principles. It's specially intended for product managers, and it's very important because it's actually um, the greatest products may fail if they do not stick to certain UX rules. So Jon will tell us more about Fitts Law, Hicks Law, Jacob's Law, and all these laws, which are very well known by UX designers, however, not really first thing in product managers' mind. So we'll be very thankful to Jon to bring us some light. So let's start. And please welcome Jon Yablonski, sorry, who is senior product manager at Boom Supersonic. They're building the first privately built supersonic jet, and he's very, I could say, he's famous about his prominent book, Laws of UX. There is a website also, lawsofux.com. Go check it. So let me start. Hi, Jon.
Hey, thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. For the benefit of our audience, you will have some minutes for Q&A session in the end of this streaming. So, Jon, we are product managers here. well, like, I want to ask you something very direct. Speak the truth, please. For you as a UX designer, is it hard to work with product managers?
No, I don't think so. I think really, the process of articulating design decisions only strengthens the more they're challenged. So, part of the the goal of through design is kind of marrying business goals and human goals in a single kind of product. And I think that having to articulate and justify design decisions or the direction of a product really just helps to make that even more stronger, and the team and your team members that are challenging you with questions to do that. They're helping you along the way. So they become your biggest supporters in the journey. So I think that, they're critical to the success of any good product.
So we are on the same boat?
Absolutely.
Trying to reach the same goal.
That's right.
Delightful products. Good. So let me share your screen. Let me add your screen to the stream, so we can start with the presentation. So the floor is yours.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks once again for having me and giving me the opportunity to share today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how designers, product managers, how team members in general can really use psychology to design better products and services. Just a little bit about me. I'm a multidisciplinary designer, speaker, writer, digital creator, based right outside of Metro Detroit here in the United States. And as a designer, really my focus is on this kind of thing. That's not necessarily landscaping or urban planning, but really how people, how human beings navigate environments. Now, as a designer, a digital designer, I'm very interested specifically in the digital space, but really it all comes down to how people use information to guide their decisions and achieve their goals through a product or service. And this is really the premise, the motivation behind not only the project Laws of UX, but the book Laws of UX: Using Psychology to Design Better Products and Services, which I had the pleasure of publishing with O'Reilly Media last April. And really the kind of goal of this book was to deep dive into very specific concepts and principles from psychology that really, I think, inform better products and services, and really kind of articulates how psychology can really help guide design decisions to make products and services much more intuitive. And today we'll kind of hone in on a few of those, some of my favorite ones from the book. We'll begin with Jacob's Law, which states that users spend most of their time on other sites. And this means that users prefer your site to work the same as all the other sites they already know. Now, this was originally coined by Jacob Nielsen in 2000. And Jacob was very specifically referring to the internet, which was, the premier technology of the time. But I don't think it is very hard to zoom out and really see how this can apply to all kinds of design. And the reason for that is because of the underlying psychology principle, which is known as a mental model. Now, a mental model is what we think we know about a system, especially how we think it works. It's really how we use past experiences and knowledge when we're interacting with something new. And I give quite a few examples in the book, beginning with this one, which is highlighting on the left a control panel. And of course, the control panel is adorned with all the toggles and switches and buttons that you would expect. Now, if you were to compare that to the form, the digital equivalent on the right, this happens to come from a Google Material sticker sheet. You can see how the kind of affordances of these toggles and buttons really informed the design of their digital equivalents on the right. And what the designers of these early form controls were doing was really building upon a pre-existing mental model that we have of physical toggles and switches, and then using that to kind of guide the design of the digital other digital counterparts. And this really helped people kind of intuitively understand how these form controls should function. Now, of course, that's not the only example. There's another one I like to point out. This happens to come from a Mercedes-Benz vehicle where the seat controls, the buttons themselves are shaped in the form of a seat. Now, the designers of this vehicle could have very easily just put those buttons in a horizontal row that are all uniform shaped and sized and called it a day. But what they chose to do instead was actually shape the buttons in the actual shape of the seat. And what they did in the process of doing this was help people just that much more intuitively understand which part of the seat they would be manipulating, simply because we all have a pre-existing mental model of what a seat is and how it's shaped. Moving into the digital space, there's plenty of great examples there too. But one of the ones I like to point out the most is e-commerce. Now, this happens to come from Etsy, but it could really be any e-commerce platform. And the reason for that is because they all follow very similar patterns and conventions. You have product tiles, you have the title of the product and the price, maybe even a rating. You have once you select that product, you can see details about it. And if you choose to purchase it, it's going to go into your shopping cart icon, which is always in the top right corner of the site. And even the shopping cart motif itself, the icon of the shopping cart, comes from a pre-existing mental model we already have from grocery stores and putting things in shopping carts. So really what the designers have done here is really standardize this interface and how it functions so that the UI can really get out of the way and enable people that much quicker to purchase product and do what they came to the site to begin with. So they're once again building upon a pre-existing mental model that already exists of not only e-commerce websites and the components and mechanisms that kind of are pretty standardized across all e-commerce websites, but even the kind of iconography and symbology that references our physical kind of equivalents. So they've really kind of built upon a pre-existing mental model there. Now, in the book, what I do to tie a lot of these concepts together is to also articulate design, either artifacts or exercises that very much relate to the parent principle. And in the case of Jacob's Law, I think user personas are great because they're the frame of reference that personas help to define can be incredibly valuable for teams because it helps us move outside of that self-referential thinking and focus on the needs and goals of the actual users, which is much more useful for prioritizing new features. So we've probably all been in product reviews or design reviews and heard someone say, well, I as a user, think this or that. And that can be counterproductive to really kind of understanding what actual users are, because we're all kind of biased and very close to the product that we're helping to build. So personas help us break out of that self-referential thinking and really start to tap into the headspace of our actual audience. All right, the next principle I want to talk about is the peak-in rule, which states that people judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its peak and at its end, rather than the total sum or average of every moment of the experience. Now, this is kind of counterintuitive, because you would expect people to kind of understand, think back and remember an experience largely because of, they're averaging every moment of that experience and kind of giving it a grade. But what people do instead is really kind of lock in on very specific peak moments of the experience and then compare that to the end as well to kind of average out how they think about the experience overall. Now, the peak-in rule is actually a cognitive bias. And in psychology, cognitive biases are refer to systematic errors of thinking or rationality and judgment that influence our perception of the world and our decision-making ability. You can almost think of them as mental shortcuts that increase our efficiency by enabling us to make, really quick decisions without needing to thoroughly analyze each and every situation. We make thousands upon thousands of decisions every day, most of which we're not even aware that we're making. Scientists actually estimate that approximately 95% of our cognitive capacity happens on a subconscious level every day. Now, the origins of the peak-in rule, and really more broadly, the cognitive biases, they kind of originate from a very important study that happened called "When More Pain is Preferred to Less: Adding a Better End." And this was conducted by Daniel Kahneman, the famed psychologist, in conjunction with his colleagues. And what they did in this study was look at basically two groups of people. Trial one, which was to stick their hand in 14 degrees Celsius water for about 1 minute. And then the second group, trial two, stuck their hand in the same temperature water for the same amount of time, but then actually dunked their hand in 15 degrees Celsius, so 1 degree Celsius difference, for an additional 30 seconds. What Kahneman found during the study was quite surprising to him. And it was that the second trial, the group that had their hand in the water the longest, they were the ones that kind of looked upon the experience overall more favorably. They were more likely to recommend it or say, oh, it wasn't that bad. And through variations of the study, what they found was that it was specifically people were locking in on a peak moment of the experience, and then the end of the experience to really determine, their overall kind of memory of it overall. Now, if you were to make this, take the peak-in rule and kind of apply this to the digital space, there's lots of really great examples. Some of my favorite come from the newsletter service Mailchimp, which, if you've ever used their service and you're about to send in an email campaign, it can be quite stressful, because with email, there is no takebacks. So you're worried about every single spelling error or your information that's not quite accurate. So that can be a stressful process, and Mailchimp actually understands this. They know this, so they introduce their brand and their here you can see Freddie, their mascot, the chimp. His hand hovers over a big red button right before you're about to send out your campaign. And the longer you wait, the more visibly nervous Freddie actually gets. On the right, you can see an animation that they've introduced that just kind of, he starts to get visibly nervous, sweat rolls down his hand. And it's just the brand itself introducing humor and kind of taking off the edge of what could be a very stressful moment. You could argue that this is a peak moment during the overall experience of using their service. Now, fast forward to you hitting that send button, and you get the, now Mailchimp is going to congratulate you. In fact, they even introduce a little bit of an Easter egg where Freddie will give you a high five until his hand gets so sore that he refuses to high five any longer. And it's just another example of the brand understanding their users and understanding when could be a moment of opportunity to kind of celebrate with their audience. So that's exactly what's happening here. And it makes the Mailchimp service overall much, much more memorable. Of course, Mailchimp isn't the only company that really uses the peak in rule to its advantage. I think Uber's another great case study with their Uber Express Pool app, where they did a great job of talking to their customers and understanding or identifying some of the key moments of you know, some of the key pain points during the overall experience. And to nobody's surprise, that really came down to waiting for their ride. So the moment they ordered the ride and then the ride actually arriving. And so what they did was to seek out ways that they could mitigate that. Um, Operational transparency. So showing, who's driving the vehicle, what kind of vehicle it is, how far away are they. Um, Giving information about how close it is to your pickup location, and even the process of discovering some of this information and exploring the interface itself being kind of made a little bit more easier to engage with through animation and things, and design kind of techniques like this really help to kind of make the overall experience of waiting that a little bit more enjoyable. And what Uber discovered through the process of doing these things is that they could reduce the drop-off point during this point in the customer experience significantly. So once again, tying together a design artifact or exercise to these individual kind of principles, I think that in the case of peak in rule, journey mapping is a very valuable one. In fact, it's invaluable for visualizing how people use a product or service through the narrative of accomplishing a very specific task or goal. As a designer, I'm of course a very visually oriented person, and journey maps I find very, very helpful because it really helps me picture step by step how people are achieving a task, and even some of the more qualitative information that they're giving along the way, in terms of how they're feeling or potential opportunities that might arise throughout this experience. You start to actually see where the peak moments are, and that could be at a positive peak or a negative peak, and you get all the context leading up to the end of the experience. And this helps to really kind of inform design decisions that are aimed at making this experience much more pleasurable, much more memorable. Now, the last principle I want to talk about is Hicks Law, which states that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and the complexity of the choices available. And this is very much related to a psychology concept known as cognitive load, which generally refers to the amount of used working memory resources. Now, in the interaction space, this is referring specifically to the amount of mental resources needed to understand and interact with an interface. I like to kind of explain, the idea of cognitive load in these two simple charts. So one is reaction time, which is proportionate to the amount of options available. Now, that could be actual options like a pricing table, but it could also just be the sheer amount of interface that you have to parse mentally in order to identify information that's more likely to lead you to your goal, right? And then secondly, the graph on the bottom is working memory buffer, which you could kind of think of as like our scratch sheet in our head. It's what we do to get work done in like a kind of on a need to basis. So it works very much like computer RAM, for example. You have a finite amount of slots that you can occupy with data. And the more you occupy these with data, the more the system slows down. Just like if you have too many apps running on your computer and your system starts to slow down a little bit. Our working memory works very similar to this. Now, to make, to point out some examples, one of my favorite things to kind of make a comparison to is this concept of a universal remote, which, if you've ever seen one of these, can be quite daunting, even to the people that own them and use them frequently. Deciding which button it is you're looking for and identifying where that is sometimes can be a challenge. which led to one of my favorite things on the internet, which is known as grandparents remotes. This is where, grandkids or grand, sons and daughters have actually taped off all the unnecessary buttons on these universal remotes for their grandparents, just to make it a little bit more usable, to eliminate the things that they don't really need, to help optimize them finding the things that they do need on this interface. And if you compare this to more modern day examples, like for example, the Apple TV remote, the interface is significantly different, right? So the Apple TV remotes are thankfully much more simple, and a lot of the complexity of the remote now gets kind of moved over into the interface itself. Now, moving into the digital space, I think there's lots of great examples to point out regarding Hicks Law and cognitive load in general. And one of them that I want to kind of talk about is the onboarding experience of Slack. Now, I don't know how long it's been since any of us have kind of onboarded Slack. It's probably been a while for most of us, but really this onboarding experience that they do is unique. So instead of dropping you in Slack and giving you a tour of all the features and then letting you kind of figure it out on your own, what they do is what's known as progressive onboarding. So they drop you in, and then the only thing you can really do in Slack at this point is to message with Slackbot. And what you're doing in the process is learning the key feature of the app, right? And it's only once you've done this that you get exposed to these additional kind of features in the app and where things are. So they're gradually kind of, reducing all the friction and only adding more complexity in the app once you've wrapped your head around the core functionality of using Slack. And this happens to be kind of similar to how human beings learn new things, right? We build upon our pre-existing knowledge in layers until we've gradually kind of built up enough kind of knowledge of whatever it is that we become a little bit more proficient in using this in the product or service. So this is just a much more kind of intuitive way to learn new technology that Slack has introduced into their onboarding experience. Another really good example that we're all familiar with is the Google homepage, which has stayed relatively unchanged for probably its entire existence. And the reason for that is its simplicity, right? When you come to the Google search homepage, you can only really do one thing, and that's search for a keyword. And it's only once you've done this, you've committed a search query, that you get introduced to all these additional controls on the website that allow you to kind of narrow in on the exact thing you're looking for. So what Google's done in this process is reduced all the friction up front to help you kind of get into the process of searching the internet. And it's only once you've done that you get these additional controls, you take on this additional cognitive load to help you narrow in on the process that you've already started. Now, once again, tying together design exercises or artifacts to these principles, I think in the case of Hicks Law and cognitive load in general, card sorting is a very relevant one. So sorting is really good for figuring out how items should be organized according to people's mental models, by having participants organize topics within groups that make the most sense to them. I remember the first time I really encountered card sorting as a design exercise, and it really kind of revolutionized my thinking of how products or services could be built. So all of a sudden, instead of me making an intuitive guess at what navigation should be and how the items in a navigation should be organized, leveraging the mental models that exist from our actual customers or audience, and then helping them to kind of inform how that navigation, how that information architecture should be structured, just changed my process of no longer necessarily designing, just designing in a vacuum, but all of a sudden incorporating the feedback from people and helping that evolve my thinking from a design perspective. So once again, card sorting can be very, very valuable for this reason. So we've talked about how psychology can inform products and services and really help make the design much more intuitive for people. I think we should also touch on what responsibility comes with this, right? So it's critical that we consider how products and services actually have the potential to undermine the goals of the people using them. I talk a little bit about this in the book, and it kind of originates with this little contraption, which is known as the operant conditioning chamber, aka the Skinner box, because it began its use with B.F. Skinner, the American psychologist, where he was really looking at how he could shape behavior in animals such as mice or pigeons through a stimulant and then a response, so a reward. A light would come on in this contraption. It was meant to kind of prompt the animal to pull a lever, and then once the animal did this, it would get rewarded with water or food. And what Skinner found in the process of his experiments was that if he varied the amount of food or water that was dispensed every single time, he could actually shape very compulsive behavior in these animals. Now, if you think about this in relation to the digital products and services that we use every day, I think it's unfortunate that you can find a lot of great, very similar experiences out there that we're using. So one of them comes from Twitter, of course, the pull down to refresh pattern, which we're probably all familiar with at this point. Very much kind of harkens back to the B.S. Skinner's operant conditioning chamber, in that we're getting a variable reward every time we pull down and refresh. It could be a tweet that we're mentioned in, or a tweet from someone we follow, perhaps a comment. So these are, every single time it's a little different, and that just helps to kind of shape sometimes much more compulsive behavior. And it's by no coincidence that the actual physical act of pulling down to refresh almost kind of mimics like pulling a lever on a slot machine, for example. Another way that technology can very much shape human behavior is things like autoplay. So, human beings by our nature have a tendency to take the path of least resistance. It's kind of like in our genetic makeup to kind of reserve energy from a time when we really needed to do that to survive. And this is a characteristic, a genetic characteristic that stayed with us. So if you look at the digital space and how autoplay will just kind of naturally play the next video, and this could very much lead to the same kind of compulsive behavior through inaction, right? So binge watching a series on Netflix, not necessarily because you came there to do that, but just simply because the design kind of led you down that path. This isn't by accident at all. And it's yet another way technology can actually shape human behavior. Another example that's very ubiquitous now is the like button. This, of course, originated from Facebook, but now it plays a part in really any social media platform that we use, and really it taps into the human being's desire for social affirmation, right? So it began as a very kind of harmless pattern to spread joy on Facebook. But, what we've seen in recent years is that this can very much kind of play into people's self-esteem and their need to be accepted by their community, and just the underlying kind of social affirmation that we need as human beings. I point all these examples out in how technology can shape behavior because overall, in the technology space, we've done a really good job of moving fast and breaking things, right? This was the mantra that has kind of driven a lot of technological advancement in the last decade. And I think really the science behind a lot of this and how it's actually affecting human beings is just now catching up with us. This is a really important graph to point out in that, organizations' focus does shift over time. This actually comes from Jesse Weaver, and he points out that, an organization and their their design team, their product managers, their their UX designers, everyone on the team, very much starting off on an operational focus to focus on a human goal, essentially, right? So they're trying to solve a very real human problem through their product or service, and it's only over time that the business-centered problems begin to kind of trump those human problems. So, it could be an acquisition, your team needs to grow, it's trying to hit an MVP by a certain time. Those shifts in the priorities of the team begin to kind of change. And this has an impact on the products and services that we're actually making. In fact, even the definition of success begins to change slightly. So we start talking about daily active users, monthly active users, time on page, time on site. And these metrics are there to kind of inform whether or not we're heading in the right direction when we're building products or services. But what's kind of, absent from any of these metrics is how it's actually affecting people. It's that quantitative data that's telling us a lot of useful things, right? It's giving us all the numbers, except for why people are behaving a certain way or how the product is actually impacting their lives. Is it helping them achieve their goals, or is it not? All right, the last thing I want to talk about here is, we talked about how psychology can be used to inform more intuitive products and services. We even touched on kind of the ethical responsibility that we have as technologists. Now it's time to talk about how can we actually just use these principles in our work. And I think it's important that we internalize and apply psychological principles that then get articulated back through things like design principles. One of my favorite parts of laws of UX overall is just seeing the sheer amount of response from the overall community in, printing out these posters, putting them up in their spaces, talking about them during their design or product reviews, using them to articulate design decisions to their managers or their colleagues. I think these are all very important and have been a really kind of exciting thing to see happen with the website. I think another way we can do this is to operationalize these principles in our work that's probably much more effective is intertwine those with our values within the team, right? And the example I give in the book is through design principles. So we've probably all heard of, design principles, and sometimes they can be more or less word fluff that aren't really actionable. What I propose in the book is ways to make them much, much more effective by really making them not even more actionable, but kind of intertwining them with values that we've defined as a team. This is just an example, but let's say our principle is clarity over abundance of choice. Now, this is already heading in a good direction because we're not just saying, hey, we value clarity and leaving it at that. We're saying we'll value clarity even over abundance of choice, which could be seen as an equally valid principle. But we're drawing a very clear distinction here, a line in the sand. And then we're validating that through Hicks Law. So according to Hicks Law, we know that the time it takes to make a decision increases with the number and the complexity of choices available. So now we have a principle, we have a law. The only thing missing here is actionable, tactical things that we can do. So we have rules. To achieve this, we must, A, limit choices to no more than 3 items at a time, and B, provide brief explanations when useful that are clear, no more than 80 characters. Now, once again, this is just an example. The principles that you define on your team will be very specific to the product or service you're making. The point here is that principles can be, validated through these laws and tactical kind of action steps that help reinforce this principle that really is meant to encapsulate the values that you share as a team. Once again, I talk about these and quite a few more in my book, Laws of UX, Using Psychology to Design Better Products and Services. And thank you so much.
Thank you, John. Pure gold. Thank you very much for this presentation. And now we're proceeding to the next phase of our event is the Q&A session. So you're all welcome to ask your questions directly in the live stream on YouTube. Basically, in the section on your right, that's the chat, and John will answer your questions or any comments you may have. So I have one question just to kick off that Q&A session. Well, there are many people who are confusing user interface design with user experience design, and basically I've seen a lot of situations when we have the aesthetically pleasing design that is very, I could say, beautiful, and all these animations and all these very well um, very well chosen colors, but the UX isn't that good, and probably people are confusing the aesthetically pleasing design with the one that is really useful. Why is that? Is that a thing that is a problem sometimes?
Yeah, I think it is, and I talk about this both in the book and on the website. But I think the aesthetic usability effect is really, that's the premise of the aesthetic usability effect. In that, as human beings, we are attracted to things that look good, right? We're attracted to things that look more polished, but this kind of attraction can quickly it can not only kind of skew our thinking of a product or service, but it can kind of take us away from the important pieces from that from a design perspective as well. So there's lots of great examples of this happening through various research and studies, but I think the main takeaway from the aesthetic or the aesthetic usability effect is that, focusing too much on the aesthetics itself isn't a replacement for good user experience, right? And the way to really understand good user experience is to understand the goals and the needs of the actual users. So, and really identifying how you can solve those through good design, not just pretty design, right? So, it's just one of those things that I think people use as a replacement for not really understanding their users well enough and how to solve their actual problems. And it can deter. It can kind of trick people into thinking it's a good product or service that they're using, but then that quickly fades away once they realize that that's not necessarily the case. There's also really great examples of products or services that do the thing that they do very well, but don't look good at all. And I would argue that these are actually better products or services because, if they're helping people achieve the goal with the least amount of kind of like, friction or bottlenecks, then it makes them a much more effective product or service. So, aesthetics can be very misleading.
Thank you. So let's continue with the first question from Carl. He's asking for examples. What's the best example you've seen so far of a popular experience where that's really poor?
Yeah, in these days, there's probably so many, there's countless, right? I think one of the ones that comes to mind the most for me is Snapchat. And they underwent a pretty massive redesign a few years back, and it was a huge failure for them because not only did they fail to kind of understand what people actually were using the app to do and what they were familiar with, but they kind of introduced this redesign experience in a very abrupt way that didn't really give people the opportunity to adapt to this new interface, this redesign that they did. This would have been back in 2017, 2018. And then what people largely did was either go to social media and complain about this new interface, or they all migrated over to Instagram. And I would argue that they never really returned to Snapchat. So it's these kind of things, and strategically how you're introducing redesigns and things like that can really make or break a product or service. And Snapchat, I think, is an unfortunate example of this, where they saw just a dramatic downturn in usage simply because they didn't really craft their redesign around the needs of the actual users. And then once they did, they kind of abruptly required everyone to just get used to the redesign instead of kind of gradually introducing them into it and helping to mitigate that kind of mental model discordance that happens when you ask people to just change overnight.
So next question is from Elena. She's asking, what is the first step when you start collaborating with the product team? According to yourself, probably from a UX perspective, how do you collaborate with the product teams?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think my favorite way to begin the collaborative process is to kind of go through things like contextual inquiries and kind of understanding the needs of your own team first. So, getting basically the stakeholders in the same room and kind of, getting all the needs and the goals out there on the table and starting to kind of prioritize and identify how you can do those. And that's just the beginning, really, because, I think the next step would be talking with people and then, actual customers or audience, your target audience, and getting internal stakeholders also collaborating in the process of user interviews with them and things like that. So it's that kind of even the information gathering that UX, a team begins to do for their own purposes can start to kind of be a collaboration opportunity with their fellow stakeholders and even their fellow developers, getting everyone involved up front and then working through that information gathering. That's probably my favorite way to collaborate and what I've seen to be the most effective.
So you're a fan of discoveries?
I'm a fan of discoveries, yeah, and in contextual inquiries and yeah, I mean, really just gathering information in a collaborative way.
Good. Next question is from Eva. Any psychology principles to help convey the design decisions to the business? And the importance of having a reason behind the design.
Yeah, I mean,
I would like to add something here to that question related to your principles of ethical design and is it can you have a reason for to present to the business that is that has roots in the ethical design, like an ethical reason? For example, why did I not implement it on infinite scroll or something like that? That could be a reason.
Yeah, I mean, both very, very good questions. And I think that, just starting with the first one where, how do you convey design decisions? Which principles help to do that? I would say all of them, really, because, they're helpful for guiding design decisions when you're, creating an interface, but equally as useful when you're articulating to your team why you did a certain thing. In fact, I would argue that you want to cultivate a culture of referencing these kind of things in the context of design decisions overall, because it's one more way to kind of break outside of that self-referential thinking, right? We can think that something works really well, but we want to kind of validate that against psychology heuristics or principles that we know to be true. And then, of course, you want to validate that further through user research. You want to do usability studies, and you want to do these kind of things that validate that again. But yeah, I think they all are useful in articulating, conveying design decisions. And anything that's going to be better for your users arguably should be better for your business, right? So yeah, and then just from a ethical reason for going one direction or the other, I think that this is where things get a little bit more tricky, because like all things ethics, it falls into a gray area very, very quickly, and it's hard to say, oh, this is the one way to do things or not do things at every single project. So this is where kind of having values that the team has established through things like design principles becomes very, very useful. But generally speaking, you don't want to ask people to do things that they wouldn't have intentionally have done on their own, right? So you don't want to follow into the trap of increasing your success metrics through dark patterns. So that's an obvious thing that you want to avoid doing. Doom scrolling through infinite loop feeds and things like that. They might be effective in driving up the success metrics, but I think what's interesting is you're starting to see people kind of coming around to being cognizant that those things are happening in some of the apps and products that they're using. And then people are leaving, they're abandoning those platforms in favor of other things. So, I feel like every other week I hear someone saying that they're deactivating their Facebook account or their Twitter account or whatever. And, it's just one of those things where people, they don't forget when they've kind of, eventually the products and services they're using are more extracting of their time and attention than it is helping to augment their capabilities and getting them to their goals. So, it's an interesting time to be working in technology.
Next question is also related to something we discussed earlier, the aesthetic usability effect. How do you explain it or teach it to management or higher ups who are focused on visuals? They want to see something and do not always grasp the value in real usability.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just pointing out the aesthetic usability effect in general is an effective way to begin that conversation, because you could simply start it off like, hey, I am like you. I think this thing looks great, but that can be a distraction from what's more important, and that's the actual usability. We should test this and see where there's potential problems with users, and then so it's really kind of like a catalyst for beginning that process that really we should all be doing in general, and that's validating design through things like usability testing and other user research methodologies.
Another question is from Milan. How to use psychology in company owners meeting when you must convince the owners that the KPIs they watch sometimes are much more complex.
Yeah.
They cannot believe just the numbers, because users are people and there are a lot of things that motivate their behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, this is a fantastic question, and it's the one that, I find myself having to kind of speak to a lot, because, once again, I think quantitative metrics have a tendency to not tell the whole picture, right? You can only be aware of the things that are in front of you through quantitative metrics, but you can't really be informed of how a product or service is actually impacting people, how it's getting them closer or further away from their goals. It's only telling you business metrics successes, right? It's only telling you things like time on site, and that doesn't actually always correlate with a successful product. It's only telling you that people are spending more time on your site or clicking on something, and that could actually be because they can't find the thing they're needing. They're struggling to actually achieve their goals. And your metrics can actually be, your quantitative metrics can be misleading in that they're telling you that maybe your product or service is increasing time on site, and all these things are good. So, I always try to kind of caveat quantitative metrics with the fact that it's only going to tell us, what we already know, and how well that's doing. It's all interpretive. It's the qualitative research that needs to happen that validates those things. You need to actually talk to people and ask them, how they're feeling about a product, how they're using it. Is it getting them closer to their goals? And so really, I don't think it's, quantitative data not being valuable. I think it's just using it or positioning it in the context that it's only going to tell us so much. We need to rely on qualitative research to tell us the other half, potentially the more important half.
And last 3 questions. What challenges did you face during the pandemic in terms of UX research and discoveries?
Oh man, there's been a lot. I think that, the hardest thing for me is missing out on that kind of face-to-face value, human connection that you get through user research and collaboration with your team, and also through user research. And there's just like an innate trust factor that needs to happen to really make those effective. And they can happen online, but it's just a lot more effort required to kind of cultivate that. So that's been a challenge, I think, and then the user research side of things, doing usability studies remotely is obviously a big challenge too. So, we're all kind of working through it. I think there's been upsides too. I think that, there's been a tendency to be able to do much, much more user research or workshops simply because the barrier for entry is much lower now that you're just using digital tools as opposed to trying to organize these in physical kind of spaces. And, so there's trade-offs that have happened for sure. But, I think that what I've found is that you can still conduct a lot of the same kind of research, the same kind of discovery, the same kind of collaboration. It just takes a little bit more effort to do it.
Are you using remote collaboration tools such as Miro, Mural, and so on?
Miro has been probably my favorite thing in the last year. It's like, I love it. Yeah. Yeah. Miro's great. I think, Figma has been a really great tool.
They have a new feature that is.
Yeah, the Big Jam tool is really great. Those kind of features that they've introduced. I think, we're fortunate that we're living in an era where like our tools are just really, really great, right? We got a lot of really great tools. So knowing how to use them properly and what's appropriate, I think, that's probably been the biggest challenge. And it makes things interesting.
Yeah, and 2 questions more. Again from Caro. At what point do you break heuristics or classical design patterns that are heavily used and inherited from places like desktop design in the favor of improved ergonomics or usability?
Yeah, this is a great question, Carl, and probably one of my favorites that, I've been asked over the years. I think that, heuristics, principles, they serve as guides, but they're not mandates. And I think it's important for us to remember that. In fact, the origins of laws of UX for me was on a project that I needed to validate design decisions, but I had no data available and needed to kind of articulate design decisions to project stakeholders. The caveat there is that you should always validate with user research, with usability studies. So if the heuristics, the principles are guiding your design intuition up front, you should always go back and validate that later by talking to actual users and conducting usability studies and things like that. So that would be a good example of when you would break it. If it's kind of you learn something new through your user research that kind of counters what your initial kind of intuition was through these heuristics.
One more. At what stage do you make technical feasibility to the preferred UX design or journey?
Technical feasibility to the preferred. At what stage do you make technical feasibility to the preferred suggested UX design journey? So the way I'm interpreting this is that, at what point do you need to kind of
probably I understand it in a way that comparing different journeys and deciding which one to choose that is more easy to implement or quick win or something like that. That's the way I understand the question.
Okay, yeah, I'll answer that question. So yeah, I think that from my experience, you usually you don't have you rely on your user research to kind of inform the direction. I mean, I think user research is one of those things that it can sometimes be a commitment for teams, but the value that it provides back to you is just absolutely invaluable, because a lot of the design decisions you're making should be guided by what people are telling you through things like usability studies and that kind of research that you should be conducting to validate your design decisions up front. So, I think a lot of times I will use that kind of data to inform which direction something will go. Of course, sometimes there's other factors that influence one path or the other. But you always want to be able to articulate that back through, psychology or design principles, and then also your values as a team, and then validate that through user research. What I found is, even if someone feels strongly about one direction or the other, and then you go into usability studies and it's very clear that that's not the right approach, most people are reasonable enough to kind of get behind switching it up and going toward what's best for the users.
We have a clarification that the question indeed relates to implementation efforts and trade-offs.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess the other way to think about that, when I read this kind of clarification, I think of Tesler's law, which states that there's a certain amount of complexity that can't be removed from a kind of core experience. There's implementation efforts and trade-offs that have to happen, and it's basically where you move that. Do you internalize that in the team, and it becomes complexity that the team has to take on through design and implementation, or is it something that you pass off to the users in complexity that they have to work through? And I think when it comes down to making a decision, I think it should always be try to internalize as much of that complexity as you possibly can to streamline the user experience as much as you can.
Last question, very quickly, really last. Last one. Okay. From Ula. Is there a way of breaking out of some of the rules by slowly implementing new designs to familiarize your users?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's, what you're really trying to do is kind of evolve that mental model that we kind of covered earlier in the talk. So gradually introducing a new experience, but giving people the opportunity to opt out of this. That's a great way to do this. I think Google has always been really, really good about this, where, they allow you to, experience a new version of YouTube, experience a new version of Gmail, but then you can always opt out and go back to the older experience. And what this is doing is training that mental model to evolve, to be more familiar with the new experience. And so, this is one way to kind of slowly, not necessarily implement a new design, but to kind of evolve your kind of that underlying mental model that is so important to informing how intuitive the experience is for users.
And last thing is something that is said by John Leach. It's a law. You cannot disagree a law. So it's something. And feedback from Carl. Thanks, John.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much all for your participation. Very active audience. Thank you very much, John, for joining us tonight. And it was a great pleasure. And the talk was really, really, really great and insightful. So thank you. Wishing you all the best. And let's hope we'll meet in person in Sofia. We will invite you once the whole thing is done with the restrictions. So we'll be happy to meet you in person.
I'd absolutely love that. And thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.